Sega, what the hell is this? How did this... Arzest. Like the Balan Wonderworld Arzest. Like, hey Pikmin Arzest. I see. So after Sonic Frontiers, a game most people seem to like well enough, and after the incredible production work put into Mania, we've returned Sonic to being shovelware. Sonic Superstars is a mess. Sometimes it has interesting ideas and gimmicks, but even then, it loves to turn around and piss all over them. And that's not even getting into the, more questionable ideas. Worst of all, this is Mania 2. Sega reached out to Christian Whitehead and he told them to kick rocks so he could make the furry game. Sonic is also a furry game. As of writing this video, Sonic Superstars is only a few weeks old, although it's a little bit older now that I'm actually getting to recording this, and stumbled out onto everything. PC, Switch, Xbox One and Series X, and PlayStation 4 and 5. So you and your loved ones can play through awkward co-op on any console you can scrounge together. Perhaps Sonic Superstars' oddest trait is that it actually kinda plays like the old games. The physics are mostly right, the momentum is there, the controls are right, it feels like the Genesis games for the most part. Not perfect, but a lot closer than we've got recently. The 2.5 games, 4 Forces, Generations, among others, have had 2D segments, and even the better games in those groups play extremely differently from Sonic's peak, and Superstars, perhaps miraculously, feels mostly like Sonic should. This sounds great, and in most games it would be that simple, but Sonic Superstars consistently fucks up on most other fronts. The game starts decent, with good if uninspired levels, and slowly spirals into a myriad of obnoxious gimmicks, overly long levels, and perhaps most notably, some of the worst, most tedious bosses I've ever seen in a platform, which can have periods of almost a minute before being made vulnerable and need to be hit 6 times each dispatch, usually. And there's a few exceptions that drag on even further. It's fucking miserable. Many bosses in this game easily surpass the length of their levels and how long they take to beat, most of that spent waiting for small vulnerability windows between endless attacks, especially later in the game, and it's just ridiculous. Sonic has never had good bosses, but the one thing that they had going for them is that with skill they could be swept through incredibly quickly, which kept the pace and energy high. This game entirely lacks that. Sonic has never been about its bosses, they've always been a formality. This isn't Dark Souls where you're meant to memorize hyper-specific lengthy battles, and even in those games you're constantly engaged in getting in small hits to keep the energy up, not just standing around waiting. The bosses are so miserable it's frankly baffling that they ended up this way at all. To get off of bitching for a bit, this game has a fairly wide selection of characters with their own abilities, and thankfully they're all pretty good. Sonic maintains his spin drop from Mania, allowing him to get the speed quickly out of a jump. Tails can fly, giving him cheese powers beyond belief. Knuckles can glide and climb walls, which makes him very good for methodical exploring, especially when it comes to tracking down special stage rings. He's my main. And Amy, who hadn't been playable in a good while, is given a whole new ability with a double jump where she swings her hammer around her, giving her both extremely solid air control and a bit of a buffer around her for hazardous enemies that would hurt her otherwise, making her a really powerful pick, especially for beginners. And they're joined by a new unlockable character, Trip the Sun Gazer, who has a really solid character design and a cute personality with her clumsiness, while also being crazy good, which makes her pretty fun to use. Incorporating elements from various characters, a double jump that puffs out her spikes, allowing her to roll up walls and along ceilings, while also harming enemies as she does, and with an entirely unique super form where she becomes a dragon, which allows her to straight up fly, which is obviously immensely broken. It's a solid roster, every character feels good and brings something strong to the table, whether it's Sonic's ability to keep momentum through drop dashing or Amy's double jump making her much less volatile. It's easily the best part of the game to experiment with different characters, even if Trip is so good she kinda invalidates everyone else once you unlock her. This widely varied roster is at least partially in service to the co-op, which is a kinda questionable addition. Much like Sonic 2's co-op via the second player controlling Tails, the game kinda proves itself unsuited to multiplayer, as the fast pace, heavy knockback from mistakes, and layered level design means players will absolutely get separated frequently and easily. It is smoothed out a bit. Unlike in 2 or 3, the camera follows whichever player is further ahead in the level, and it usually does a decent job of tracking them, which means the game isn't halted by one player being out of sync with another, because they absolutely will be. And furthermore, instead of having to wait for Tails to slowly fly back in, players who get left behind can instantly warp to the leader, while also matching their speed, preventing them from instantly being left behind again. While it's definitely still awkward, jank, and more than a little ill-fitting for the pace of the game, it's perhaps pulled off the smoothest it could be, which means the game is, for the most part, not so bad to play in multiplayer, although it's not quite the most interesting co-op game you'll ever play either. The game's largest new addition is Emerald Powers, a neat idea and a questionable execution, primarily serving as a band-aid on the bullet wound that are this game's bosses. Each emerald collected via special stages I'll get to shortly unlocks an ability that can be used from a weapon wheel, which itself is kinda strange to see. And each one does something, at least, though I'd only call 3 of them useful and only 1 fun to use. In order of unlock, let's just whip through them. Avatar is the strongest ability by far, and it's the first one unlocked, creating an army of clones that stampede through the air for a solid 20-ish seconds. This ability can put some big dents into the earlier bosses before their vulnerability phases start getting spread out a million years, and even against the more obnoxious bosses tends to at least be 1 or 2 free hits, which is a titanic relief. Bullet is the only fun ability and one of the few useful ones. For its duration, the player can hit square to turn into a fireball and rocket in any direction, allowing the user to get some insane verticality, speed, and abuse the fireball's invincibility to chip away at bosses. It's admittedly very broken, allowing free access to the top path at any time, if not outright skipping challenging sections, but it's fun to use, and as powers only refresh at checkpoints, it isn't completely game-breaking. Water turns the player into water, allowing them to swim, breathe underwater, and climb waterfalls. One zone of the game's 11 has water or waterfalls in any significant amount, and while it is pretty strong there, it's basically useless in any other scenario. Ivy makes a giant plant grow from the ground to serve as a series of platforms to higher areas. Every character but Sonic already has some way to cheese verticality via extra jumps or climbing, and even so, the fireball does the same thing but with substantially more verticality. It's genuinely useless. Vision reveals otherwise invisible and non-interactable platforms and items. While I'm sure there's somewhere in the game that this gives cool rewards, I never cared to run around blindly with it turned on for 20 seconds because it just seems so situational. Slow slows down time. This ability is good in basically any and all situations, but especially helpful against bosses, for it usually negates at least one cycle of their 4-hour-long attacks, even though its immense slowdown usually blocks off getting more than 1 hit. Extra is kinda unique in that it works differently for everyone. Sonic gets his homing attack for about 20 seconds, which gives him the ability to chain jumps to higher areas. Tail can spin on the ground, which is only good if you're not just flying over everything. Amy throws her hammer in an arc, which gives her a fairly functional projectile. Knuckles gets a punch with a slight energy blast in front of him, and Trip gets Mario-style fireballs, although their range is pathetically short. Honestly, I feel like these should have just been inherent upgrades that you unlocked upon getting the 7th Emerald. None of these, sans the homing attack, are particularly impactful, especially when they only activate for such a tiny amount of time, and it would have been way more impactful to just have a nice bonus for getting all the emeralds that further distinguishes the characters. Of course, Extra is also unlocked simultaneously with the super forms. Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, and Amy have the pretty typical super forms, require 50 rings to activate, burn through those slowly, and return to normal at 0. Invincibility, super speed, higher jumps, and while this is good, it pales in comparison to the insane shit Trip gets. A dragon form that can fly in any direction, is invincible, and can shoot fire a short distance in front of her. It's fun to use because it's so hilariously broken, even if the worst bosses are so absurdly long that the form burns out long before the boss does. Superstars has 3 special stages of varied quality. The main special stage is found via rings hidden in every single stage like Sonic 3. The main special stage is actually pretty good. I like to call it Spider-Man stage, as it's an odd little 3D stage where the characters swing from points to chase after the emerald. It's decently fun and easy to understand, although the final few stages are very obnoxious with how precise they are, which can turn them into a grind of repeatedly starting a level over with a convenient nearby ring to farm attempts at. The second special stage appears just like Sonic 1, crossing a checkpoint with a large amount of rings causes one to spawn, and the stage is more or less Sonic 1's special stages with the awkward rotating maze that the player navigates in ball form. It wasn't great in Sonic 1, and while they added some mechanics in, like switches that alter the path, and while it's a bit easier thanks to Sonic sticking to walls a bit better, it remains pretty janky, awkward, and uninteresting, especially since the only reward is tokens for customizing the Metal Sonic for the not very good multiplayer mode I'll talk about later. The final type of special stages appear at seemingly random and are very simple ring gathering minigames that last about 15 seconds, with no obstacles, just moving back and forth to grab falling rings or fall into rings. They're a tiny little distraction, I probably shouldn't have even brought them up. Sonic Superstars loses quite a few points on presentation. It's not completely irredeemable, but it's really bland. There's a few good bits. I like the classic Amy design coming back, and I suppose Fang too, a character first introduced in the Game Gear game Sonic Triple Trouble, and who has only had minor cameos since Sonic the Fighters. And his robot is cool too. And of course, the animated cutscenes that appear scarcely throughout, matching the style seen in Mania, are really strong. Better than anything else in the game really. A scant few of the stages have pretty cool themes. zones. Golden Capital and Cyber Station zones have some really unique theming, with a large golden city and a sort of retro arcade look that changes the appearance of the characters, which, while kind of cheap looking, does charm a little with the variety of Sega arcade game references. However, everything else is kind of just there. The 3D graphics make the game look inherently cheap, and given this is a soft sequel to Mania, oof. Although the Spider-Man special stages are pretty good looking somehow, I think it's just the low poly thing. Stage themes are mostly not great. I know Sonic has kind of done everything at this point, but Bridge Island is Green Hill again, but a little curvier. Sky Temple stands out a bit from similar stages, but isn't too far off of something like Sky Sanctuary. Pinball Carnival closely follows several casino stages like Casino Nights, although pulling back on the casino stuff because of the EU, I assume. And of course, there's a desert level. Most of the game just isn't visually thrilling, especially when paired with the kinda lame 3D modeling. The music is also average. Perhaps the only song that sticks out to me is the boss fight theme, and not in a great way after hundreds of tries on the final bosses. It certainly lost its luster. Meanwhile, stages don't stand out. They're serviceable, but coming off Sonic's long legacy of incredible music, it's a bit of a shame. The music also ends up kinda all over the place, some of it aligning closer to the modern music, some of it trying hard to feel retro with simple beeps and boops. It feels like it doesn't have one solid direction to go in, which makes it cluttered on top of being a bit bland and generic. Bridge Island Zone is the game's best set of levels, which isn't saying much in the grand scheme of things. Most Sonic games start very strong with an open and freeform level that allows a lot of building speed and multiple paths, with more difficult to maintain ones near the top. It's nothing new. Even in being the best level, it falls in line with the same stages that it's visually following from, and doesn't have much to show for it beyond maintaining a trend. Even its boss is an imitation, more or less being a copy of the Death Egg robot with a slightly tweaked gimmick, as it throws its arms around and they can be attacked to send them back. Although the mid-boss in the first stage is a rather neat Sonic CD style chase with a giant fish, which, while reminiscent of the start of Adventure, is a solid enough chase boss and, unlike everything else in this game, doesn't take a million hits to take down. Speed Jungle also comes out mostly unfazed. While the Vine and Tumble gimmicks are pretty linear, they aren't offensive. However, Act 2 has a rather questionable one, with the caves becoming obscured in darkness outside of a tiny radius around the character. It's one of those odd pace breakers that adds little and slows the game down, either requiring blind luck, speed killing patience, or memorization. It's not exactly an uncommon issue for Sonic games, even the good ones, although it is a little sad to see it back here. Speed Jungle also features the first character-specific stage. They're a very odd inclusion for a game that was so heavily marketed for its multiplayer, forcing one player to go through a stage with a specific character built around their attributes, which is kinda cool, honestly. In this case, a fairly solid Sonic chase stage, again like Sonic CD, that serves to reintroduce Fang. It's not very complicated, but it keeps up the energy and pace and is decent enough. The boss of the second proper act is one of the game's very few good ones. It still has a good amount of tedious waiting, but it's better contextualized by needing to trick the boss into hitting itself with its own attacks by dodging them, which is actually a satisfying way to make the player wait. Also notable, the player potentially has access to Fireball and Shadow Clone Jutsu, both of which are extremely good against the mid-boss in the first stage and basically become a necessity later on. For some reason, Sky Temple Zone is one act, and it's a pretty long one too, and thanks to that it kinda starts to drag on. But relatively, it's a pretty decent level that just kinda should have been too. It has non-intrusive gimmicks, a nice if familiar location, a fun gimmick with a storm near the end that causes objects in the environment to float about. Again, not a new idea, but it's a fun enough one. The boss is the first truly tedious one though, having to do a platforming section between each hit makes it slow down to a crawl. Pinball Carnival is the last okay level. It doesn't do anything particularly right, but none of its gimmicks are terrible either. Combining Sonic and Pinball is pretty much a no-brainer, and outside of that, and some odd sections of riding roller coasters, the level remains fairly straightforward throughout. The mini-boss has a kind of fun gimmick where it's flipped upside down when all of its panels in the area are touched, giving easier access to its vulnerable head, but use of emerald powers can make it way less tedious by just skipping the panels. Not to say that the emerald powers fix the bosses, they're certainly a band-aid on a bullet wound, but it kinda works here, and the actual boss is fairly inoffensive. Lagoon City is the obligatory water level, taking many cues from Hydrocity. It's not remotely the worst water level in Sonic, I mean, the Labyrinth Zone. It's pretty generous with air bubbles, has multiple upper paths above the water in most areas, but it does suffer the inherent annoyances of water areas. plotting movements, altered jumping physics that require adjusting. It's not as bad as it could be, but it's also not great. And a slow and plotting underwater boss that needs to be chased to different areas multiple times, and you end up with a level that's generally kind of a slog to play through. Amy gets her own solo level here too, and it's one of the strangest. The level itself is fairly standard, but lacks the zone's water, and instead has gigantic fruit littering the level Amy can destroy to raise a counter that seems to do nothing. These solo levels tend to have a bit more story, perhaps because they can be more controlled thanks to not having to juggle 4 characters, and this level has a kinda cute scene where Amy befriends Trip, although it leads to some extremely dull gameplay where Amy carries Trip, which kills her speed and jump height, which just isn't very fun, especially because Amy has some of the best movement in the game via her double jump normally. Sand Sanctuary is another too long 1-act zone, while also very closely taking aspects from Sonic Mania, a game that is both the prior 2D Sonic and in direct lineage with this game. It feels a little too soon to be aping one of Mania's few original level themes. That said, the level itself is okay enough. The bouncy snake platforms are cute, it's long but doesn't feel excruciating, and the warm colors set a nice tone, but it does have the first truly excruciating boss, a giant mole robot piloted by Eggman that hangs out at the back of the screen. After a bunch of nothing, it shoots out rocks, then it shoots out weak standard enemies. The blue ones can be launched back to deal a little extra damage, but it's not entirely consistent. Then it drills out to the foreground and becomes vulnerable for a second, and then that loops. With bad luck on the enemy trick, or just not knowing it, as it isn't telegraphed very well and you kinda just need to stumble into it, the fight takes a very ridiculous 4 or so minutes. And even if you do know that you can bounce some enemies back at him, it's still quite long. In hindsight, this one isn't completely miserable. Every boss following this works basically the same way, but even slower and more excruciating, but it's a real bad sign of things to come. Press Factory is where the level gimmicks get a bit out of hand and start dragging levels down with them. The first act's gimmick is a gigantic piece of machinery in the background that stomps into the ground every 5-ish seconds, launching anything touching the ground into the air, player included, and shifting certain platforms. And while it does have some occasional fun uses, like running underneath hazards between stomps, it's such a constant force in the level that simply moving around becomes a chore, as you're liable to just go up into an enemy or onto a different path, and it's especially annoying when it cuts off a jump you had already planned because you don't roll into a ball when you're getting launched. It's also overbearing that it distracts from the game at hand for this gimmick. Act 2 follows up with its own overbearing mess of a gimmick. About every 20 seconds, the player needs to press a button to prevent a giant drone in the background from insta-killing them. And while this is somehow less overbearing than the other gimmick, it's still a lot when combined with a slow level full of insta-kill crushers. Neither level can really stand the weight of the gimmicks they're placed under and become exhausting because of them. And of course, both the boss and mini-boss are loaded up on insta-kills too, with the mini-boss being a dodge the crusher's game while waiting endlessly for an opening, and the main boss carries its own crusher, although admittedly this is one of the few bosses in the game that lets you kind of exploit it with emerald powers and good play to get around its waiting cycles. Golden Capital ends up being one of the better stages. Its gimmicks, like transitioning to the ceiling and working through areas backwards, going into the background, jumping off of giant stripper poles, are all fairly simple and unintrusive, and the unique level theming helps it as well in a game whose level themes are pretty unoriginal otherwise. It's nice and simple, original, and even its mid-boss at the end of Act 1 takes advantage of the gravity shifting and has its own fun gimmick where it steals all of your rings, but hitting it returns them to you so that you can eventually get to Super or something like that. Golden Capital has an abundance of rings in general, I assume because it's the earliest time you can possibly have Super, plus it kinda matches the lavish city aesthetic. The solo Knuckle levels is cool too. Knuckles climbing and gliding gives the level a cool bit of verticality and focuses more on measured exploration. However, the end boss of Golden Palace is the first really horrendous one. An auto-scrolling fight against Fang. Between brief periods of honorability are sections of dodging lava and flamethrowers that are slow, tedious, and drag on for upwards of 30 seconds, and this goes on for the entirety of the fights. On top of the general awkwardness of the auto-scroller format, needing to consider gaining momentum for moving upwards and downwards to dodge attacks. Like so many things in this game, as you'll soon see, it just doesn't know when to end gracefully. Cyberstation is a cute but long 1-act zone with funny little pixelated filters and voxel enemies, and some very obvious attempts to grab onto Sega's arcade roots via a variety of what ultimately end up being horrible gimmicks in the form of transformations. The octopus transformation, which comes up the most in this marathon of a level, makes the player float in the air. The intention is to float between obstacles in a little maze, but the squid retains Sonic's typical momentum despite moving in small bursts without room for fine movement. It feels very imprecise, and while the areas can be cheesed by taking hits and recollecting rings, it really doesn't feel good to do so when the primary issue is the controls and you're just cheesing so you don't have to deal with them. The mouse transformation doesn't fare better. The mouse can climb wires and has the option to move left, right, or forward at junctions, but limited screen real estate makes climbing the wires awful. Just blind charging directly into enemies, and this is intentional given the occasional dead ends. However, unlike the octopus, getting hit sends Sonic all the way back to the bottom. It's so tedious to try to memorize the entire maze to dodge everything because there are so many just blind jumps into them. The rocket ship transformation is whatever. It becomes a rather tedious auto-scroller where boosters cause it to speed up and blocks slow it down, with the ultimate goal of dodging the walls to reach the end. It's used in one brief segment, and while it's a bit out of place, it's not nearly as jank as the other two, honestly. The level of course ends with another terrible boss, the first of the two-phase bosses. Honestly, the first phase isn't so bad, besides hits potentially being an insta-kill because of course it's an auto-scrolling chase boss. But man, that second half gets so jank. The boss doesn't indicate when its post-hit intangibility wears off, so it's very easy to just jump through it into the abyss, and then you're starting fresh from phase 1. And of course 12 hits on something with 20-second invulnerability phases is just generally a tedious affair. The length of bosses slowly worsens as the game drags on. Frozen Base is so fucking bizarre. The first act is actually pretty good. The conveyor belt gimmick is a fun, simple addition. They can be switched back and forth to provide extra speed or lessen it, and the level design really goes hard playing with the gimmick, including using it in the mini-boss, which itself is pretty fun. The Solo Tails level is the exact opposite, a claustrophobic and slow level set in icy caves full of hazard, meant to serve as a Tails flying level. It's very tedious and plotting, and full of things you can't see coming, because it's so vertical that you're just falling into pits blindly and praying. Then the level kinda just loses the plot, with the second main act being an homage to Sega's arcade hit Fantasy Zone, a shoot-'em-up title which is wholesale recreated for the entire act, including bosses which recreate the bosses from that game. It's really strange just outright abandoning being Sonic for an entire act, albeit a short one. I know that in Sonic Mania it briefly switched to Mean Bean Machine, but that was like a Sonic-related property and it was just one boss fight. This is an entire Fantasy Zone level and Fantasy Zone boss fight just stuck in the middle of the game. Really, the best you can say about it is that it's very short. I don't think that this is a very fun minigame. It kind of derails the game a little bit. Thankfully it's not made to be extremely frustrating, as someone actually was considerate enough to make the rings fly upwards when you're hit, so recollecting them makes it fairly free, although tedious. It's not like I'd call it a bad or frustrating segment, it's just kind of very weird. The game ends not with a bang, but with a whimper. Egg Fortress has a fine first zone, unimpressive but a harmless level, with its only major gimmick being brief collapsing floor and ceiling segments, and really its only issue is that it kinda drags. Then Act 2 comes about. Eggman activates a time machine and you play the level backwards, but the things that used to fall down now fall up. It's mega tedious coming out of an already long level, and the first final boss of 3 is horrendous. The fact that there are 3, and each one is terrible and tedious in its own way. It makes it hard to comprehend what the fuck they were thinking. Sonic has never had good bosses, but they were usually bad because they were so exploitable and short, which at least made them painless. This first final boss is, I suppose, the least bad, but also the least functional, and even at its best drags on for genuinely 7 minutes between its two phases, several skippable but tedious cutscenes, and the extreme periods of waiting between hits. The first phase can only be harmed by reflecting blue missiles at him, specifically from his backside, which is a 30-second process of running behind him, locating the blue missile in the crowd, avoiding hits, which basically cuck you out of dealing damage, waiting around, dodging the red walls for 30 seconds, running away from the collapsing floor for 30 seconds, dodging electricity for 30 seconds. The phase is honestly not so bad when you work out what it actually wants you to do, and doesn't offer substantial mix-ups, but it's so fucking tedious that it becomes easy to make one minor mistake and get fucked, and failing in phase 2 results in the whole thing going from the start again, making repeated attempts at the excruciating second phase even more unbearable for how long it takes to get back for another shot after getting cheap-shotted. The problem is ultimately the second phase is fucking cancer. First off, the boss can sometimes spawn on top of you before you take a step. This happened to us several times in a row and instantly kills you for 3 minutes of phase 1 again. That's a relatively unlucky outcome. But like Cyberstation, this chase boss's vulnerability period is long and vague. Enjoy trying to hit him and just falling through the floor, or sometimes properly landing a hit and not bouncing back. His arm swipe attack instantly flings you off the stage, and if it doesn't, rings have a bad tendency to just phase through the floor on both phases of this boss. His laser attack, immediate insta-kill. Rings don't matter. Have fun. Why even give me rings if you're just gonna insta-kill me? The boss is substantially too long to cheese with super, nothing works properly. Sometimes you lose instantly on phase 2, it has 3 cutscenes before and throughout to skip, which adds to the tedium of replaying it, and emerald powers are largely ineffective on the first phase, so the extremely generous refresh of all of them on phase 2 isn't all that useful, although honestly emerald powers are more or less a necessity to make phase 2 tolerable. It's shocking how genuinely horrendous this boss is, and it's probably the most tolerable of the final bosses. It only gets worse. After clearing the game, Trip's story is unlocked. In the same way as the solo character stages, it's a one-player affair. Again, for how heavily this game's multiplayer was focused on in the marketing, it's bizarre that it's shoved aside at every opportunity. That said, most of Trip's story is what it is. It essentially feels like a bad hard mode ROM hack from the mid-2000s. You play through every stage in the game again, including the solo ones and bosses, but enemies and spikes are, at seemingly random, strewn throughout the levels. However, Trip's overpowered slate of abilities, between double jumping and climbing, plus carrying over emerald progress from the main game, means a lot of levels can be trivialized by her even before her absurd super form, which pretty satisfyingly cracks the game in half, and especially trivializes most bosses thankfully, with some obvious exceptions near the end. However, the real twist this mode has is its final boss, easily the worst boss in Sonic, hell, easily the worst boss I can think of in a platform, and quite possibly one of the most insufferable fights in gaming overall. At bare minimum 7 minutes across 2 forms, several cutscenes to skip, endless waiting between phases, and of course insta-kills around every corner because rings would have made it too tolerable. Cards on the table, this fight was a 6-hour grind of misery. Nothing in this fight is fun. It's a 7-minute marathon of sheer focus and endurance to prevent yourself from being instantly sent back to the first phase to get cheated again. I remember looking at a speedrun of this game while I was writing this script, and the guy wrote in the comments, "The final boss is so miserable that I can never play this game again." Even as I wormed my way into an extremely consistent strategy for the already painful first stage, which itself takes a minimum of about 3 minutes, and even at my most consistent, I would still occasionally get fucked on an insta-kill. The first phase consists of a fairly simple pattern of dodge missiles. Fang comes in with insta-kill laser bars he throws around, so you either need to swerve under or over them, hit him, dodge missiles. Fang and his shadow clones dive bomb the stage. If you're good, you can hit him here, but it's kinda difficult and risky. Then missiles, and on and on and on and on and on. Honestly, while it's still pretty frustrating after hours of fighting it over and over and over and over and over again, following devastating defeats on the second phase, I found rather consistent strategies for him. After dodging the missiles, you can jump off the hill between the lasers immediately to end the first laser phase early, either jump into the dive bomb, or if the pattern is bad, use the fireball to snipe it, repeat step 1, use the fireball to fly over his head on his next attempt to spawn lasers, use slowdown to hit his final dive bomb, and end with shadow clone jutsu. It sure as hell ain't fun to do, but in the grand scheme of things, it's pretty doable. Phase 2 on the other hand is just a sheer grind that requires immaculate play, foreknowledge, memorization, and a substantial amount of luck. The pattern is essentially this. Fang shoots ants that pop out of the ground from below you. You need to get behind him, get underneath one, and bounce it back before it hits the ground. This seems very inconsistent until you realize one always spawns above you when they make a noise, so you just stop immediately when you hear it, and you can usually get it. He then does the most absurd move in the game, lining up a triangle of spider webs and shooting them. Touching one freezes Trip in place, and if you can't mash out in like 1 second, which I never could, you get insta-killed, rings or no. And he can repeat this process up to 4 times before relenting. You basically need to start on top of one of the large hills to weave through them, and even then, they're very precise, ungenerous with their hitboxes, and get progressively faster and more complicated. Having to dodge this at least 7 times because the boss takes 9 hits is fucking absurd. And if you miss a single hit, the absurdity amplifies as he's just gonna keep throwing this attack out. It's cruel and ridiculous. Following this, he shoots bombs that split into red and blue balls and bounce around erratically. Blue balls need to be bounced back, but certain erratic patterns can just basically hard block you from progressing. It then repeats, but also he likes to throw in curveballs. After the 3rd hit, a second wave of ants comes out immediately, so if you're prepared for it, that's a good free hit. After the 6th, a second wave of bombs, which is also shockingly generous. And after the 8th hit, he pops out an excessively cruel desperation attack where he whacks off both ends of the stage, and if you're not prepared, you're just dead there. Blocks you in his arm and tries to insta-kill you with a head slam. And if you don't hit him here, easiest done by using the fireball. He does it over and over and over until you hit him. Plus, of course, there's one final round of spiderwebs that are overwhelmingly fast. It's a 9-minute hell slog that requires constant focus, constantly cheap shots you, is full of drawn out waiting periods. It's so ungodly miserable, badly designed, tedious, long. I can't even begin to fathom how any of this was considered a good idea, let alone got through playtesting, because every element is designed to waste as much time as possible by sending you back to the start for any and every minor mistake. It's almost incredible how fucking bad and obnoxious it is. Of course, I did say 3 final bosses. After clearing Trip's story, the final story unlocks, because a giant black dragon awakens and threatens the world, I guess. Kinda out of nowhere. The final story consists of a very, very long final boss. Optimistically, it takes about 15 minutes per attempt, although admittedly it's less frustrating and more so just very fucking tedious. I never got angry like with Fang's mecha, just kind of very bored. Supersonic is invincible, and therefore he's only vulnerable to the dragon's black holes on phase 1, which can be dashed out of at the cost of eating into 10 rings, which as typical slowly deplete over time and result in failure at 0. It's a long-term ring management game where you eventually learn to ignore every attack and just fish for rings, optimistically by getting Knuckles or Tails to spawn in. Touching them gives 10 rings immediately, and they drop an additional 15-ish. Phase 2 is honestly easier than the first, as the black holes that eat into rings so heavily are replaced by very baitable fireballs to swerve around. The biggest challenge is maintaining focus for the entire 15 minutes and knowing when to give up and restart, because you need about 50 rings going into phase 2 at worst. And more is definitely preferable. The one element that does outright suck is the final QuickTime event, because of course. The QuickTime event's timing is vague and specific. It's hard to tell at what point in the circle lining up with the meteor the button is meant to be pressed, assuming you intuit you need to press a button at all. Pressing it too long counts as a failure, as it attempts to register for the following meteor as well, which is very fucking annoying. And you need to succeed at this extremely vague QuickTime event 6 times in a row. Missing one easily burns an additional 10 seconds of waiting on top of the 15-ish needed to get to the end of the QuickTime event at all. It's not that bad, frustration-wise anyway, but it's just so fucking tedious. 15 minutes is not a small amount of time to burn on one attempt to lose to a QuickTime event. I don't know if Dark Souls has a single boss that comes close to the length of this one, and at least in those you're always actively making decisions and getting in hits and progressing. Of course, what modern game is complete without a bad tacked-on multiplayer mode? The battle mode is an 8-player online mode, although it can be played locally with bots or friends if you hate your friends, consisting of 3 randomly selected challenges on randomly selected stages, although they're all very small slices of a stage, sometimes infinitely looping, such as collecting the most stars, surviving an onslaught of attacks from cannons in the background, or simple races. And honestly, I was so burnt out I really couldn't manage to care. Although honestly, making it a series of little Mario Party-like minigames with the core Sonic gameplay at the center isn't the worst idea you could ever have, and I could see it potentially being fun with the right group, even if I was kinda underwhelmed by them in the moment. Like I said, with the right group it could probably be a fun, chaotic little game mode, although I was largely unimpressed. Also, holy shit, letterboxing it into 2 tiny screens in local play is such a goofy idea. It's honestly ridiculous how tiny they managed to make the 2 screens. This is a fucking PS5 game. There had to be a better way. You could have done horizontal split screen. You could have made the stage small enough that it would just fit on one shared screen. Anything would have been better than this. Anyway, yeah, Sonic Superstars. It's a fucking mess. Classic Sonic moment, truly. At its best, some of the levels are decent fun that, while not peak Sonic like 3 and Knuckles or Mania, are fun enough to play through. The roster has some nice variety and abilities, and at times, Superstars is plain, simple, and enjoyable Sonic. But so often this fucking game aims straight for the floor, pulls out a fully automatic machine gun and shoots itself in both feet, the shins, thighs, and the balls. The graphics look like cheap Unity engine trash. The music is starkly forgettable, a mega sin for the series considering how many bad games are partially saved by amazing music in this franchise. And the game flagrantly and intentionally loves to waste your time with pace killer bosses full of frustrating insta-kills and cheap shots, which are often longer than the levels they follow, and get up to frankly absurd lengths with the final 3. It feels like the game is constantly wasting your time, making you attempt and re-attempt shitty first phases just to flagrantly fucking cheat after. It's incredible how genuinely unpleasant the game can be, seemingly on purpose. And it sucks out any of the simple joy that the better levels have, compounded by an occasional dud of a level like Press Factory. The co-op is superfluous largely, with an inability to keep pace that makes it constantly at odds with Sonic's core design, and which gets outright abandoned for more than half the game counting the bonus stages and Trip's story, and the battle mode is decently undercooked. The game is just not very strongly put together. It's scattershot, decent at the best of times, and so fucking tedious. And that tedium and frustration far outweighs the better levels in this game. It's another unfortunate but sorta routine failure for Sonic that puts its effort and time in all the worst places and ends up being just bad because of it.